During the early 19th century, reformists noted that the prison system, often called the Pennsylvania system of solitary confinement or the penitentiary, had resulted in an increase in suicide rates among prisoners. With a renewed emphasis on religion, allowing such a situation to exist was threatening the salvation of those who knew about it and did nothing. The Auburn system was then introduced, whereby persons worked during the day in groups and were given everything from moral instruction to education. There was rigid discipline. However, the idea was that the prisoners would be given tasks to perform, often creating things for the prison directly or even things that could be sold. The goal of this system was to instill good work habits and ideas of industry that was supposed to be rehabilitative in nature, and it actually did have the effect in that there was a decrease in suicides, and the system would be copied worldwide. Another aspect of this dealt with public asylums. Many times, for lack of any other place to put individuals, if someone could not be cared for by their family because of an illness or anything, including a mental illness, they often were put into prison because there was nowhere else for them to go. Dorothea Dix, a rather outspoken reformist, began a crusade to separate these individuals that had some sort of illness, particularly a mental illness, from prisoners, and to create hospitals specifically for them. Her actions led to the establishment of at least 5 mental hospitals here in the United States, and she even argued before Queen Victoria and even the Pope for the humane treatment of people elsewhere in the world. The temperance movement was another significant reform movement of the early 19th century, largely because of the perceived tremendous amount of alcohol that the United States was consuming on an annual basis. Reformers noted that there was an epidemic of alcoholism that went hand in hand with spousal abuse, family neglect, and even chronic unemployment, as well as workplace injuries. With the emergence of the Second Great Awakening, ministers had started to lecture citizens against the use of liquor. The American Temperance Society was founded in the wake of these actions and benefited both from the renewed interest in religion as well as in morality. Eventually, the movement would split between moderates who wanted to allow some use of alcohol and more radical positions demanding total abstinence. The moderates tried to rely on moral persuasion, and the more radical individuals wanted to see laws passed that would prohibit, restrict, or outright ban alcohol. It's more of these radicals that would dominate many of the largest temperance organizations after the 1830s, and eventually temperance became synonymous with prohibition. It would be the first state to pass widespread legislation banning the manufacture and sale of alcohol, and became the first dry state, with wet being the term used to describe states that allowed alcohol. Many reformers feared that drunkenness, particularly the increasing prevalence of binge drinking, was a threat to law-abiding society as well as economic prosperity. Because how could men act as responsible workers and vote as responsible citizens if they were insensible with drink? Religiously motivated temperance advocates came to see drinking as a sin, a way that was giving in to the depraved self and that was incompatible with Christian morals. Some also focused on the damage that alcohol could have on a family. Looking at family destitution and violence, reformers reckoned the cost to American wives, mothers, and children of heavy drinking by their husbands and fathers. And then, of course, another point of view for these temperance advocates was medical, as the more health-minded reformers popularized a radically new way of looking at alcohol. At one time, Americans had traditionally considered a strong drink to be healthy and fortifying. But after about 1810, many physicians and even writers on health were telling their patients and readers that alcohol was actually a poison. And it had some success because in about 1820 or roughly 1830, somewhere in that range, the annual consumption just of hard liquor was at 5 gallons per capita annually. By 1840, that number had declined to less than 2. Education reform was another reform movement of this era. Elementary education had existed, at least on some levels, since the early colonial period. Massachusetts had required public education since the 1630s, but it had actually often been limited to those who could afford it, because books, etc., were not provided, so it limited the options for the poor. But as the common man had begun to come to power with the revising of voting requirements in the wake of both the Revolution and the War of 1812, some considered that it was in the public interest to educate the masses, since they would presumably make better political choices if they could read and write. This began a campaign for free public education for all, and would include all books and supplies as well, not just the payment of teachers' salaries. Still, this was resisted in the rural areas because children were often needed to work the farms from a young age, and living in isolated areas often made it difficult for schools to even have enough students to pay very much to a teacher. In many cases, the teacher was simply the oldest student in the area or the one that had the greatest amount of schooling. Quality varied wildly, and it made sense that cities offered better opportunities. But still, some level of elementary education was available in every state. And reformers sought to improve the schools as well, with better teacher preparation, teachers' colleges, improved textbooks. This was certainly something that was particularly of interest to Horace Mann, who helped develop a Massachusetts-wide state curriculum as opposed to focusing on local curriculums. Even the creation of spellers to standardize education, something, for example, the Noah Webster creating the first dictionary, which also emphasized an American version of the English language. Some of the other reforms included longer school year and a compulsory attendance. Secondary education was much slower to develop because the primary purpose of this level of education was to prepare young men for college. Now, this was mostly financed privately, but again, with the expansion of the vote, public secondary schools or high schools were beginning to be established. There were about 100 such schools by 1860, but these were concentrated in the larger cities due to their larger population and tax base. Education for women that was publicly financed was generally limited to elementary education. Women had long been seen as the primary educators of their children, as well as the moral guidance of the home, so being able to read the Bible was seen as necessary for women and girls. During the Revolution, the concept of Republican motherhood was put forth, with women's roles being to raise good citizens of the Republic, and citizens were expected to vote wisely. Higher education for women was limited and generally privately financed. Both high schools and even colleges did exist for women, and a few even studied law and medicine, but that was definitely not the norm. Eventually, women expanding their studies was seen as acceptable in society, especially if they would be pursuing teaching or nursing. The women's rights movement grew out of this Second Great Awakening and the moral issues because those moral issues were becoming political issues. Family sizes had dropped, particularly amongst women in cities, giving them more time to devote to moral issues as well as religion. There had been long been a belief that women ran the home and raised the family, while men dealt with business and politics. This division of male and female spheres is known as the cult of domesticity, but is largely a myth because women frequently worked alongside their husbands and fathers, running businesses and farms. They also increasingly worked outside of the home, especially in the Northeast, where the factory system developed, and this was especially common before they married. In the wake of the Revolution and the nationalist period that followed the War of 1812, women began to demand more equal treatment, especially when it came to land ownership and legal issues. As women became more and more involved in the political sphere, especially the anti-slavery movement, they were frequently running into instances where they were denied the right to participate, and so they began to demand increasing rights for themselves, beginning what is effectively a feminist movement. In 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and others organized the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York, in response to being denied the ability to speak at a national anti-slavery conference that was held in London.